Hello and welcome to our special session on new hybridities, the Indian diaspora. Um, Before I just introduce our host for today, I'd like to say a few words about a couple of the initiatives that we're doing over the next few weeks. First of all, from next Sunday, that is from the 17th of October, we have a series of Sunday sessions at the same time, exactly the same time, as part of the doctoral consortium on architecture and philosophy. We'll be looking at some of the key thinkers of the 20th and 21st century: Walter Benjamin, Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Judith Butler, Jacques Derrida, and Hélène Cixous. I'm delighted that we have got a wonderful lineup of panelists who will be discussing their work, including one very special session on Jacques Derrida and Hélène Cixous. We have Doina Petrescu, who is an architect who studied under Derrida and Cixous in Paris. She will be there, alongside Peter Eisenman and Bernard Schumi, two figures who collaborated with Derrida. And this should be an historic moment when we have a chance to bring everyone together to reflect on Derrida's impact on architecture. So this promises to be a very interesting series of talks every Sunday from the 17th of October. And we will give you details if anyone wants to find out about them. We'll also be sending out a mail shot about how to register for this particular event. For today's event, though, we're delighted to be able to extend or to have the second version of our new hybridities series, as it were. There are a couple of innovations that you might have seen in the last few weeks that we've introduced. One is to hold workshops, tutorials, that is, rather, on various software tools. We start off with Rhino, and then last Saturday had a very successful session also, both of them very successful, on Clip and VQGAN. And we intend to do those twice a month from now on. So they will form a feature in our events by popular demand, I should say. The Rhino session with Ahmed was extremely popular. Also, alongside that, we had a wonderful session a few weeks ago on some students who, or not postgraduates, graduates who studied in America and elsewhere in Europe and had gone back to China and had developed a very unique way of operating. We described that one as in terms of new hybridities. And that, I think, was a really special session. We had quite a few presenters, and it was a very dynamic, action-packed session. So we decided we're going to continue this. In fact, next month we'll have another session looking at Dubai, which is probably one of the most hybrid cities in the world in terms of its cultural influences. But today we're having a session on new hybridities on the Indian diaspora. That is, not necessarily Indians who studied abroad and returned to India, but rather Indians who are already studying abroad. And that is particularly special for a number of reasons. We, over the past 2 years or so, we've incorporated quite a few Indian voices in our lineup, both from working in practice, such as Shahjay Bhushan and his brother at Zahidid Architects. In fact, last week, Maya Misri is, of course, himself from India. And later on this month, we have another session on India. So it's a very Indian flavor to this particular month. And this, I think, is going to be intriguing for a number of different reasons. One of the things is my kind of pet theory about India, that we're about to see an explosion of super talented computational architects in that country, partly because India is so strong anyway at computation. And I think that's going to open up a whole series of interesting kind of questions. But the other reason why new hybridities is so relevant in terms of India is the leading theorist on hybridity, on hybrid culture, is an Indian philosopher at Harvard called Homi Bhabha. And he himself is completely hybrid. He is a Parsi, that is to say, of Persian descent in India. So it seems almost like the term hybridity is linked to India. And I come from a culture where the Indian culture is thoroughly kind of part of British culture. I'd say one of my favorite foods was to go for curry when I'm in England, more so than fish and chips. The most famous dish that we have in the UK is now chicken tikka masala, and not roast beef and Yorkshire pudding as it used to be. So India has had a huge impact on on my culture. And I think my culture through the AADRL and other places and Zahidid Architects has also had a huge impact in India. So this is going to be a very interesting session. I'm delighted to welcome Bhavleen, who will be the chair and the host for today's session. I will come back and join you for the questions. Welcome, Bhavleen.
Okay. Thank you, Neil and Digital Futures team for helping in organizing this session, and a very warm welcome to our listeners. Today's session brings together some of the questions I've personally resonated with in my teaching and learning experiences at Balwanchit School of Architecture and at Elisava School of Design in Barcelona. This session attempts to continue discussing constantly evolving knowledge among the Indian diaspora, who, through their interdisciplinary and cross-cultural experiences, attempt to vocalize new hybridities in architectural practice. With their formal education in architecture, the presenters find themselves redefining their work as they navigate through their time in India and abroad. The projects presented today only begin to define how future architectural practices would construct cultural statements and systems in a completely new hybrid space. The session today will include 10-minute presentation by each of the invited guests, followed by an open discussion and closing remarks. Our first four presentations are by recent graduates located and working in Spain, Germany, and the US, while the last two presentations discuss their experience in disseminating through practice and teaching in some of the most promising institutes in India. On that note, I would like to now invite our first presenter, Misri Patel. Misri currently holds an academic position as visiting assistant professor of practice and fellow at University of Tennessee in Knoxville. During her master's at Tawde, she was assisting Professor Sean Alquist, where she received the 2019 MSDMT award. She was also the recipient of Ballard Fellowship at Co-ed Lawrence Technological University and continues to research at University of Michigan with Kate Novel and West Mickey. Misri, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Can you all see my screen? Can I have a quick thumbs up? All right. Okay, yes. That helps. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I'm humbled and extend my thanks to the team at Digital Futures. For everyone who don't know me, I'm Misri Patel. I'm a visiting assistant professor of practice at UT Knoxville, and most recently served as the research lead at Tubman College, University of Michigan. Oops. Right. As I thought of what projects align with the strong social ethos of this talk, I was forced to pause and sort of look at my meandering pathways. So this is just a quick overview of my trajectories over the years. And the trajectories seem to have sort of been alternating between academic institutes and also professional practices. And in a lot of ways, these have either consciously or subconsciously contributed to where I am today. In this presentation, I briefly summarize the contributions of my prior professional experience, recent research, and potential trajectories. I'm going to mainly center around the projects that I have been working on through the lens of craft paradoxes of high tech. To start with the very first project, I'm going to highlight my experience at Tech, based in New York. Prior to graduate school, I honed my skills at this firm and worked with on a prefabricated house with 6 shipping containers. So there are something around 22 to 28 million shipping containers on the face of this planet right now. This project in particular stemmed not only from looking at architecture as a robust permanent structure, but also as an object and hopefully as a product. Working at LaTeX gave me a frame of reference to understand the concepts, influences of technology and architectural fabrication research. And the work really closely looked at metal as the main material. And also in addition to that, sort of explored how the building industry is also being largely influenced by neighboring industries and how that sort of contributes to the way we look at structures today. In a way, this was also a place for me where my love affair with materials kind of started. So I often go back to these trajectories to sort of understand what comes next. A few of the other research projects that I'm sharing stemmed from my time at Tubman College, University of Michigan. The next two projects sort of bleed into each other because they're both related to the CNC knitting machine and glass fiber reinforced rod, and GFRC, that is glass fiber reinforced concrete. During my graduate training, I was fortunate enough to serve as a research assistant to Sean Alquist. And during this, I was a part of a textile tensile structure that utilized the knitting machine with GFRP rods for a prototypical study. And this study was primarily for a sensory space for children in the special needs classroom. The research largely sought to push computational design and material fabrication past its technical challenges to engage in discussions of human behavior and interaction. After getting a sneak peek into this world, I learned more about this as a student and dove deeper into the CNC knitting machine. The course investigated modes of computational design methodologies, which place material as an a priori agent in the generation of complex structural morphologies. In order to explore the relationships of material and form, we engaged in a number of methods through physical prototyping and computational simulation. A critical aspect was to understand relationships between methods and experiments, rather than from a single linear process or design medium through the development of the textile hybrid prototype. As a part of the knitting group, I studied the relationship between the textile structures and focused on small incremental steps, which include computational tools and testing material properties evolving to the development of a large-scale prototype. The next project was a part of my MS capstone project with the very industrious and talented Mariam Al-Jomeri and Shanchun Ben under the mentorship of Professor Glenn Wilcox. This also piggybacks on the previous project because this thought of using textile, but also questioning its capacity to be used as a knitting formwork system, in a way further strengthened our ideologies between how to use age-old ways of making with newer advanced fabrication methods. So after being introduced to this, we dug deeper and really got into the mechanics of the system to understand the histories within the discipline. Quickly, we realized that the frame knitting machine was first introduced in 1500s, but it took about 300 years for textile to seep into the building industry that uses textile as a way for concrete casting process. Using computational methods, the project aimed to redefine the role of concrete within formwork, where it acts as an active contributor rather than a passive one. The scale and nature of the surface offer a significant opportunity for craft by harmonizing the material process with an analog and a digital workflow. One of the aims was also to robotically scan the pieces made so that we could have a longer sort of conversation between translating digital to physical and back to digital. This was one of the aspects that was sort of being pushed for and is under the way. In a way, we're also trying to gather observations from each of the instances and really understand the stitch type and the stitch length to have greater control over the geometry once concrete is sprayed on it. In a lot of ways, we were also trying to gather instances and sort of recalibrate the system to understand how each of these different instances could be clubbed together to understand a larger global perspective on the geometry by studying its local nature. We weren't trying to understand a language, but instead, in a way, create a catalog or a dictionary of all the words so that we could build the language itself. Along the way, we had a number of failed attempts, which made us question the material system as a whole and not just a process as an individual way of working. And a lot of these ideas sort of merged and blended into each other once we understood the digital workflow and also the characteristics of the material itself. In a way, it also challenges and questions the adoption of advanced fabrication with a lab site context. It hopes to engage with people who may not necessarily have the skills or access to deploy digital fabrication on site, but also question the logistics of the process itself. What if it were to be prefabricated and deployed on site with labor that has decades of experience with this material? The next project sort of throws light on my fellowship as a part of Florence Tech University, which was also in collaboration with Ballard International. This experience really captured and catapulted me into looking at our neighboring industries, because at one point my colleagues were 3,000 KUKA robots. And it was interesting to look into neighboring industries, at the same time question how we could potentially use them in architecture to sort of streamline architectural production. As a part of the fellowship, I worked towards interrogating and streamlining robotic processes like 6-axis milling, hot wire cutting, and incremental sheet forming that could expand the workflow of architectural production, and also in a way explore digital design theories and methodologies. As one of the offshoots of this fellowship, I started looking at industrial waste, in particular metal swarf, in the form of steel and metal pieces. Typically, this material is a waste product from industries that make molds for car industries and other shipbuilding products. I started doing material studies that you see on the left to test its applications as a composite building material, sometimes by compressing the swarfs to form thin sheets, and leaning on epoxy resin as a binding agent to form upcycled material, and form a system using aluminum hardware and extrusions. So these are a few studies that try to look at using 6-axis milling as a way of creating geometries, and not necessarily use the logic of starting off with a geometry and using the technology to mill out the surface, but instead look at tool paths to really streamline the process of production. One of the other aims of this project was to understand the thermal and acoustic qualities of each of these components. While at Lawrence Tech University, I taught prototyping courses, which served as the continuously evolving think tank for the investigation of constructive strategies between computer-aided design and advanced fabrication techniques. All of these experiences often beg the question of what is the role of architectural speculation when the gap between conception and physical translation becomes instantaneous. And a part of my brain always wanted to marry the old and new. Dwelling around this idea, in the machine age, my mind was often stimulated to explore ways of making with advanced digital fabrication techniques, but also leaning on practices that have been around for over 2,000 years, which led to a project that I started in school, but the pandemic sort of offered a good time to pause and sort of look back at how we could appropriate it to sort of suit our current building industry. So this technique folds together indigenous craft and material practice and uses storytelling as strategies to unravel the complexities of society. In a lot of ways, it begs the question of if building sites could itself become like pop-up factories. For this project, we used a robotic rod bender that was developed by Wes McGee at Tubman College, University of Michigan. But we also tried to look at how a lot of these components could come together to almost form gabions or cages to sort of bring together this idea of gabion making, which was used primarily for dams or to cordon off the water, but also look at it through the lens of contemporary practices, which could marry the two concepts. Drawing from these studies, now I see the opportunity for processes to serve as a model for craft-based workflows. In my own interest of merging age-old and new ways of making, I now ask the question of if or can building sites itself become pop-up factories? Technological advancements in the building industry and fabrication have led to an abundance of custom geometries and unprecedented precision of parts. In contrast, hundreds of craft traditions that form the largest or the second largest workspace in developing countries after agriculture struggle to compete against machine-made products. Through my experiences in architecture school, I've come to appreciate the use of different materials, production methods, and multidisciplinary collaborations. Over the years, my inclination towards computationally driven design grew, and I tried to make imaginary bridges, frequently perplexed by one question: does the status of craft matter in the digital age? This was documented from my recent visit, where I tried to look at smaller, and this also sort of bleeds into some of my work at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, where I'm teaching studio and also trying to understand how we could use advanced manufacturing methods like 3D printing or sort of metal sheet forming to understand how this could almost marry this ancient process of brick building, but also sort of look at the molds they use and have, and in a way, or hopefully have a more meaningful connection with all of these practices that seem to be thriving really well already in the way they are, but I feel there should be more engaging contribution between the two. And my work at the University of Michigan right now primarily focuses around class, details of which would be shared shortly. But all of these experiences, if they do start contributing through the lens of digital and also through the lens of age-old ways of making, can we now ask the question if it can be used as a speculative physical model? And that's my time here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Misri. Thank you for setting such a such a beautiful tone to the presentation as well. I'd like to now invite Prashant. Prashant Chavan is an Indian architect and artist currently working in Frankfurt after completing his studies at Stadelschule architecture class in 2019. His interest lies in questions concerning aesthetics and politics of image, specifically those engaging with new forms of representation and production of the human subject. His recent research deals with making projects out of contemporary tools such as photogrammetry, virtual reality, and augmented reality. Prashant, All yours.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. Yeah.
Yes.
So I would like to thank Bhavleen and also Digital Futures for bringing me on this platform. So yeah, I just begin. So I would like to give a small conceptual framework for my presentation before we dive into my projects. So I would like to revoke some of the ideas that were very relevant in the late 19th century in the Germanic context, that the study of history in Germany was confronted with various methodologies that were drawn from natural science. The study of the sensory organs, in particular sight, proved especially influential for the visual arts. Also, in the light of great advances in theories of optical perception, works of art were positioned at a crucial intersection of the perceptive law of mind and nature. Also, paintings, sculptures, and buildings were evaluated according to psychological and physiological criteria. And one of the key persons that I would like to invoke is Hermann Helmholtz, and his idea of the Wissen and Kennen. So he makes a distinction, a very interesting distinction between these two kinds of knowledge as expressed by two common verbs. Wissen, that's knowledge gained through logic, language, and expressed through words. And there is another department of our mental operations which combine our sensual impressions that are not capable of direct verbal expression. In German, it is called as Kennen, a second kind of knowledge. And here you can kind of distinguish both these faculties as Wissen as something that's derived from concepts, prepositions, language, which is very rigorous in science, physics, chemistry, history, and philosophy, and is operated through logical induction of conscious mind, and Kennen, which operates on a non-conceptual, non-prepositional, non-linguistic, and is obtained through experiential acquaintance and operated within an aesthetic induction of unconscious reasoning mind. And if we come a little after in the history, we also have August Marshal, who was a German art historian, and he also emphasized, or he was the first to formulate a comprehensive theory of architecture as a spatial creation at the frontiers of perceptual empiricism. He differed most from other theorists, and he insisted that bodily movement through space rather than a stationary perception of form was the essence of architecture. He also kind of rebutted Heinrich Wulfflin's theory and the essential role of bodily masses inside the space. In 1903, Schmarzow also wrote something like the germ and the central point of all art remains man, the human body. As a rule, all spatial intuition arises from the interaction of body sensory organs with the body itself and with the aspects of the material world. And these are the two essential spheres of sensation. And somehow the technologies or the tools and methods that have been dealing in the last 2-3 years and the ideas that emerged towards an architectural thinking of form and space, I could categorize them as in two parts. One is about architecture and the human body, and an aesthetics of realism. So I think virtual reality, augmented reality helps invoking these ideas of architecture and how human interacts with these spaces. And through photogrammetry, you kind of attain an aesthetics of realism, which could go in the direction of parafiction, defemeralization, estrangement. And of course, there is like a lot of potential with the tools of VR and AR that you can develop projects that are based on kinesthetics, which questions depth and perception, the varying resolution in space, and also it kind of brings to an idea of a choreographic space. So now I would like to introduce some of my projects that I have been doing in my university and also outside the academic sphere. So first is the Schmeared Garden. And in this project, you see myself in an open landscape where I was chasing ducks or like running around ducks. And you see the green landscape and you see this gray patterns kind of, these are the trails that the ducks have left behind as I was following them. So I saw that this kind of running behind these animals as a kind of movement diagram. And this is also one of the other scans where you see a figuration like there's one duck and you see it has kind of left its trace. So you see the multiple facets of the same object through its different viewpoints. And then I think photogrammetry as a tool also brings in a lot of questions about the loss of data. Like when I was scanning this landscape, you see there's like a lot of smearing effects that were produced, and these were like the gaps that the software could not read. And these were some of the interesting points where I started to compare my results with a classical painting. So eventually the project ended up creating a garden of varied resolution. And as you take a look inside of this garden, you see the questions of foreground, background are kind of blurring into one another. And in the front, you see them as like really clear, distinct object. But as you turn your camera or your viewpoint, you see this loss of data within the surface. And also these kind of new techniques helps me to look at the conventions of architectural representation, or seeing these photo scans in its most traditional form of a plan or an elevation, and then looking at what kind of new information that these drawings are giving me back. So I was very interested in these wide gaps that were not able to read by the software, and how these wide gaps could almost read architecturally as voids or as openings. The second project that I would like to introduce is about scalar resolution, and it resulted into a physical model, and it also challenged this idea of how you look at this model. So when I had placed this in the space, and when you're looking at this model, the viewer was always kind of going back and forth. So it eventually challenged the viewer's position in the space. So there were some parts that were like really minute and detailed and intricate, but but you really have to like position yourself in the space, in the gallery space, to look at these objects. And also for this project, there was an additional augmented reality layer where when you place a screen in front of this physical model, the virtual model appears in front of you. And what I had as an augmented layer also challenged this notion of how the person would choreograph themselves when they are seeing this physical through this virtual interface. So I had given some instructions where you can pan left, right, move front and back. So I was eventually again trying to choreograph the human body inside the space. And as you go back and forth, you see there are like figurations that are appearing, there are figurations that are dissolving into one another. So these were really interesting points, and it kind of disconnects you with your physical position, and you are kind of in sync with what you are observing through this interface. And now I would present my master's thesis, that's Richtungsschmuck, it's directional adornment. So this word is borrowed from German art historian or architect Gottfried Semper, and I would come to that later. But in my thesis, I was exploring this relationship of movement and directionality, and it also I was looking at two ways of seeing, one that's panoramic and the other is saccadic, as these two ways in which our eyes sees an object. And the thesis further explored similar tendencies of panorama and saccade into the ornamentation of Gothic and Baroque, to eventually create a kind of a third hybrid or new modalities of ornamental forms. Therefore, it does not perceive ornament in its traditional sense, but an ornament applied in panoramic sweeps to create surface articulation. So Gottfried Semper was already talking about a relationship of motion and ornament, where he was studying the bullet and how it kind of dives itself into space, and he was then also relating this motion into the architectural ornamentation. And you see this curvilinear or this smooth shapes, those were the results of this of this motion. So when I was actually in the space, in a physical space, and I was scanning my data, so I had these two processes where one was a panoramic way where I was sweeping my camera from left to right, and other was a saccadic where I was constantly moving in and out of the surface. And you see, it's like you see this eye movement diagram. So our eyes, they do not follow a linear way of looking at things, but they are constantly jumping from one point to the another. So there's always a saccadic way in which our eyes look at the space. And these were some of the experiments that were happening again in the same 18th, 19th century from ophthalmologists. And these were some of the experiments that I conducted on paintings and images. And I was also trying to understand how our eyes are looking at certain forms, where they are taking pause, where they are not, where they are moving more smoothly. So these were some of the uh, eye vision tracking systems that I was working with. And eventually I started also to scan some of these ornamental spaces. And when you look at these spaces, there is always an interplay of volume when you look at them from a distance and when you start to get close to them. And I think these are the potentialities that the photogrammetry as a tool brings in. And then I did a comparative study for these two kind of architecture where I was saying that Gothic is having more panoramic tendencies. So when you look at a Gothic ornament, your eyes kind of move in a linear way, unlike a Baroque interior where your eyes are stopping at one point to the other. So then I was scanning these two kind of architecture and further processing the scans, and then also looking at them in a kind of in a very traditional architecture, looking at the exteriority, what are the architectural elements, if there is some fluting mechanism or if there's a pixelation which is creating these surface ornamentation. And when you look at the Baroque, it's consists of interiority, theatricality, and you see the saccadic movement in the Baroque is a result because of its articulation of 2D, 2.5D, and 3D surface. And then I was trying to come to a third ornamentation, like a hybrid, I would say, if we marry Gothic to the Baroque. And I was interested in this third criteria. And then I kind of applied these onto like mundane everyday blocks of housing. So these were some of the results that you see once these two ornaments kind of meet each other, and there's like a constant interrogation of the panorama in the saccade and as how your eyes are looking at this ornament. And this is how the objects or the blocks that you design, they kind of go back into the city or into a context. They kind of blend in with the architecture that already exists. And you see these everyday elements like the CCTV camera, the signboards, the labels that already exist kind of also blends in with this new third form that I designed. And this was a summer internship that I was part of at the University of Innsbruck in Austria, and it was titled as Hypnotomachia Nature, and it was a sculpture that was designed by Giacomo Palla and Stefan Meyer from the University of Innsbruck. And we were assembling it, and we had digitally made this and also then digitally fabricated it in Rotterdam. And the interesting part of the sculpture was how it tries to attain a kind of realism, because the process was 3D printed concrete, but then it was deposited in the form of a powder. So it's like, unlike you get these layers, so the idea was to like make it more and more smooth. And I think this idea of smoothness is also slowly coming into light, where how digital fabrication could be more smoothened or made more soft and made more towards a real looking thing. This is a public art project. So after my graduation, I am doing like some small collaborations with artists and art collectives, and this was one of the collaboration that I had done. So it was so you see this black box, that was a box that we had as a event space, and we could host events in it. And the idea was to look at this box from a virtual point of view. And so what I did, that I had 3D scanned it. So the intention was to just 3D scan the box, the unit, and to see how the box kind of sees itself in the city. But the fun thing was that it also kind of blended the things that I was not interested into, maybe the trees, the sky, the landscape. Even on the right, you see this big tower from Coop Himmelblau. That's also kind of eventually blending back with the landscape. So I think these softwares or these techniques, they have an inherent quality in themselves, which you had not planned, but it kind of comes out when you have them in your 3D software. And then this is a work in progress with an artist, Sarah, in Frankfurt. And she is an artist, and she makes mixed media artworks. So she's making paintings and sculptures. So in this collaboration, what I'm doing is that she has a physical model, and then I'm working on looking at some digital representations of that physical model. So she has her own idea of or a theory of color and application of paint, but then I'm more interested in the volume and body of the missing data, what I say. When you look at this point cloud and you look at these transparencies, I think it's something that kind of goes back into the discipline of art. And I'm interested in this cross-disciplinary exchanges that are happening at the moment. So yeah, that's it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Prashant. You opened up a lot of good conversation. I'm hoping there are multiple questions arising already. Now I would like to invite our third presenter, Shivani Tavre. Shivani also has been part of Directional Architecture class, where she completed her master's in architecture and aesthetic practice. She was awarded the Gunther Bock Prize for her thesis research investigating an environment for pseudospecies by Tom Main. Through her work, she explores the ill-defined limit between the real and fictional worlds generated using AI. With her presentation today, she explores how AI algorithms affect the existing spaces and environmental context. Shivani, please go.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Shivani Tavre, and I'll start by sharing my screen now. Firstly, I'd like to thank DigitalFUTURES for providing this platform and for inviting me today. I will be presenting my master's thesis work done at the Directional Architecture class. I'd like to start right away by inviting you all to watch an episode of a wildlife documentary series titled A Stroll Through Nature's Other Umwells. In this series, Sir David Attenborough explores the hidden habitats in nature that coexist with us in our world. He explores the surreal creatures and their umwells, meaning the environments. In the first episode, Sir Attenborough gives us a peek into a fascinating day in the life of the creature Cartonicus bisporus.
In the lamp lives a colorful, flowery moth named Cartonicus bisporus. It is a moth lamp, and that means light. One day, after a troubling visit from the duck, Copernicus leaves her lamp and sets out in search of 3 upside-down yellow flowers. A quest undertaken in the company of insects, ducks, and kitty palm. Copernicus accepts one of the 3 upside-down yellow flowers and returns home to her lamp, a very wealthy moth.
The world that we saw in this episode is constructed entirely by results produced by using artificial intelligence. My work is about using AI as an apparatus for world building. By combining real-world elements and AI-generated data, I construct a fictional reality, a surreal world that exists within our worlds by virtue of algorithmic image culture and data dissemination. It is a third hybrid space that is formed by the combination of 2. I will now take you through the process of this world building. The first step is generating pseudospecies using found objects, then use AI as apparatus to build its herbarium, apply more AI algorithms on this data and form creatures. I apply another set of AI algorithms and form its Umwelt, meaning the environment of a species. I began with creating a set of 10 plant species by assembling found objects. I nomenclate them as pseudospecies. I make a classification system similar to the Linnaean classification system and classify them as follows. I will further explain this using the species Cartonicus bisporus as an example. Where do these species belong to? To find this, the first step is to generate a herbarium. I use different AI algorithms as apparatus to investigate and construct the species and its environmental aggregate. Google reverse image search finds a visually corresponding plant. The plant recognition system recognizes it as an actual plant. Insect recognition application recognizes it as a moth. Using the AI to read my fictional plant, I create a pseudo-fictional setting for these species and generate a herbarium. This is the overall result. The AI recognizes what we do not see, and it matches the fictional plant to our real-world data. This data estranges the way we look at reality. The second step is generation of creatures. Adding to the previous set of AIs, I form sentences using keywords from the previous result. A butterfly moth sitting on an umbrella with a carton. This sentence that doesn't make any sense in our reading, the text-to-image generator reads it to form this image output. Through the images, I extract the forms to create a creature. This is the overall result for all the creatures. The last step is arriving at an Umwelt, meaning an environment. Jakob von Uexküll is a German biologist who established the Umwell Theory. He defines an Umwelt as an environment that corresponds to the sensory and biological endowment of any given organism. Simply speaking, each organism can be imagined to be living in a bubble where the perception and sensory experience of each organism can be configured differently. I try to find an environment or an Umwelt for my pseudo-species as well, with the help of using different AI algorithms. So I use more such algorithms such as image generation and image description. This forms the overall genealogy of the species. How to synthesize this data to arrive at the Umwelt of the organism? For this, I use words generated by image description algorithm and run them through a story generator. This is the story generated. These sentences that don't make any sense in our world forms a narrative with my species Cartonicus bisporus as a protagonist. I use certain sentences to form a storyboard. By combining the visuals from the previous image outputs with the narratives, I create different scenes. This is the storyboard for the first episode that we just saw, Cartonicus bisporus. This is the result of all the synthesis, and this is in short the overall process. I will now conclude my presentation by showing a second episode for the species Bubus tuberfolia.
In a plate that lived the colourful Casey mantis named Pubis tuberfolia. It was a mantis plate, and that means dry grassland. One day after a troubling visit from the praying mantis, Pubis leaves her plate and sets out in search of 3 leafy pink shoes. A quest undertaken in the company of insects, people, and teddy bear mantis. Bubis accepts one of the 3 leafy pink shoes and returns home to her plate, a very wealthy mantis.
That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Shivani. Thank you for such a visual treat. Okay, so we'll go ahead with our fourth presenter for today, Dushyant Asher. Dushyant is an architect and researcher interested in exploring processes and systems of space making. After completing his master's in 2010 from Standard Architecture class, he continued his interest in material experimentation in academic space at various schools in India. Along with his practice, Dushyant is actively involved as assistant professor at School of Environment and Architecture. His work and interest involve computational processes and material exploration through cultural means and technological possibilities, opening up hybrid conversation at the intersection of art, architecture, and technology. Dushyant, yeah.
Yeah, can you see my screen and hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, hi. Sorry, I'm just having some trouble with my presentation.
Yes, perfect. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just having some trouble with my machine. Can I come back in a bit?
Right. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Karthik, would you like to go jump ahead and go first?
Yeah, sure. Sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Karthik is a practicing architect and holds master's degree from Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, where he worked with Harvard Visual Computing Group and MIT Sustainable Design Lab. With his practice at Voxelscapes and Codable in Bangalore, he explores the intersection of digital and analog and is currently working towards incorporating algorithmic design processes in the domains of art and architecture. So yeah, Karthik, all yours.
Thank you, Bhavleen. Is my presentation visible now?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks to the team, both Digital Futures and you, for inviting me and having me on the panel today. So I'm going to jump into it. As Bhavleen mentioned, I run two practices actually. One is a traditional architecture practice in the conventional sense called Voxelscapes, and more recently we've started a second studio focusing purely on generative art. So my work spans across the three domains: architecture, computational design, and generative art. And for the talk today, what I'm going to focus on is I'm going to run a thread through all three, in the sense, through the use of data-driven narratives. So I'm going to focus on the journey of how I leverage data across mostly computational design and generative art, less about architecture today. So this is one of the earliest instances of me dabbling with data. It's a grad school project under the mentorship of Professor Christoph Reinhardt at Harvard and later at MIT. So the first three pieces I'm going to show today are all data visualization tools that are still connected to the building design industry. And as the as my presentation progresses, I'm going to go more from the literal to the abstract, and I'm going to jump into data-driven art, and in the end, probably one project where we've done a digital to physical installation. So this first one here, so one of the first things that struck me when I was learning, when I was trying to dabble with building modeling and simulations, was that most of these simulations are very dry from a visual perspective. It's very hard for me as a young architect back then, kind of makes sense. And I really figured that there's a big divide between the people who run the simulations and as designers as to how we consume the data and how we leverage it for our work. So this first one is a very, very early prototype of trying to take daylighting information. So what you see here is a simple room with one window opening that can change its, that you could parametrically vary in size. And I was trying to create an interface that you could possibly in real time visualize the impact of the simulation on your design space. I think this was just around the time when Rhino and Grasshopper had come in. So on the left, what you see is a crude interface that I built up using this toolkit called VVVV. It lets you program in real time and bridges that gap that I was talking about earlier. So in this visual, what you're seeing is on the right are simulations that have been baked in. So I've run, let's say, about 100 simulations for varying sizes of openings. And on the left, the interface, the two sliders, what you see here, that you could play. And in real time, it kind of basically loads in the simulation information and kind of makes it look like it's real time, although it isn't. But this is the beginning of my experimenting or exploration into this notion of how do you build interfaces for designers that kind of make more visual sense and more interactive and alive. So the second one, the earlier one was of daylighting, and this one's about building energy modeling. So again, this one's a custom written toolkit that kind of we use conventional tools to run a building energy modeling simulation. Predicts all sorts of energy modeling, the heat gains and all the different parameters as to what affects the space and the temperature of the space. So I built this interface that kind of loads the data back in And on the top, what you see is a temperature chart that goes from every hour for the whole year. And at the bottom, you have all this information that kind of, I'm showing you images today, but these are all interactive. So you could, on the right, these set of zones or rooms, you could click on them and these will update in real time and so on and so forth. So early attempts to dabble with data. And these, at this point, I'm still working with data in a literal sense. It are actually data visualization tools. And the last one I'm going to talk about in this series is the project I built at, again, under the mentorship of Professor Reinhardt at MIT. So we were, I've covered daylighting and energy, and this is about natural ventilation. So we were interested in trying to see how do you bring in a typical design process. You start your design and then you go further down, and much later in the process is when the simulations happen. And at that point in time, it's too late to make a big design change that has an impact on the project. So we were trying to dumb it down at a very, very early design stage. So without going into too much detail, this tool would allow you, the 4 tabs at the top. So it allows you to load your project data. You can specify the location, the kind of building that you're trying to design for, office, hospital, residential. And there's a simple CAD editor on the panel where you can draw your building footprint and maybe, basically footprint. You don't do any 3D modeling, but in 2D. And then what you're seeing here is a real-time analysis of how the building performs. So you're looking at temperature, wind. On the right, if I had to build this L-shaped design, for example, in this oriented in a certain way, and then that's my natural ventilation potential. And you could dig deep down into hourly or monthly information. You can change the orientation, change the design, and so forth. And all of this will update in real time. So now I'm beginning to author tools which are actually more useful for architects at an early concept design stage. And this particular tool had one additional caveat or interesting side effect, which is I recorded all the variants. So at any point you made a design change, it will load it. So you could go back and forth. So it's kind of sort of records the history of your of the design decisions. So this was at the grad school and just maybe about a little after the grad school. And I'm going to slowly dive into more recent work where I'm leveraging data. So the first project I'm going to talk about is, this is a commissioned project piece for a apartment complex in India, in Bangalore, the city where I'm currently based out of. So we were commissioned to do, as part of the generative art studio, Code Ballet, we were commissioned to do a site-specific interactive piece that has data that is relevant to the context in which the building is located. So what you're looking at here is these 2 towers in the middle. That's the apartment that's built now. And we've mapped the urban environment around it, all the buildings, extruded them to the correct heights and so on. And then we went on to simulate the amount of solar insolation on the street network. So the reason we're doing that is, and we did this for the whole year, every hour in the whole year. And this is some variants, but I'll quickly run a video here. So the idea was that we're going to install this piece in the apartment in the lounge. And as residents walk around it, there's this constant motion of through the day. So in the morning, there's less solar insolation and all these extruded, these white boxes are very shallow. And then as the sun, hits the noon and you get more insolation and it kind of extrudes and goes back again towards the evening. The idea was that when doing this, each color change is depicting 1 month. So we take a typical day in a month and we run through the whole day. So this is going in a loop. And for the residents in the apartment, when they're constantly engaging with this piece, over time, they kind of get a sense of the impact of heat on the surroundings and so on. And this is, so now all the rest of the work I'm talking about is more on the art end of things. And this is using audio as the data. I'll quickly show a small video to kind of explain how this works. So again, so the idea was that, we've simulated multiple pieces of audio, and then this is also a commission piece where we create a catalog of work, but using audio as data. So again, this is real time and interactive in the sense. So the next piece I'm going to talk about is using air quality index as data. So this one's for the city of Mumbai, I think, for a specific location. So very often, I mean, all the bigger Indian metropolitan cities in India do have some sort of a display somewhere near the airport or somewhere around, where all you have is a simple LED display which just shows you what the AQI index at a certain point in time was. So again, we were commissioned to do this, to put up a display in one of the larger urban nodes in Bangalore, where they were going to display on a larger screen. They didn't want to look at the typical just a number, because people don't understand it and there's no absorption of information in that sense. So we were trying to create a visual encoding that kind of gives you the idea about how bad the pollution levels are at that point in time, without going into exactly, I mean, without talking about numbers. And the way this works is, if you look at the legend in the next slide, yeah. So I'm going from January to December. So we've taken a historical data for a whole year for that particular location at that point, and then anything that is light green and so on is obviously, is less AQI at the under 250, and then as you go higher, it gets worse. So comparing it to multiple cities, then you would see this is 3 big cities in India, and a clear demarcation of how good or poorly these were performing from a quality index. I'm going to jump into one more where we're going to talk about mathematical functions as data. So this one takes in this particular instance, we're using something called an attractor function. So this is a class of equations called Clifford attractor. So we're trying to visualize the mathematical functions. And there's a multiple variants of the same. So by changing certain parameters, you get this wide variety of artifacts, and we would try and document all of this. And the same thing in 3D, but this is not a Clifford attractor. These are about 6 different attractor pieces at this point, and we were trying to visualize the same. So again, here we're using math functions or numerical data. Now we're in the far end of the talk, going to be more and more abstract. This one's taking data from my personal sleep tracker. I have a hand one gadget that kind of tracks my sleep, and this one's I'll play a small video for this. So we do a lot of data-driven work. We try and customize it to specific, either site-specific or client-specific. So the idea was that we're going to eventually install this as part of, let's say a certain client is interested, and we're going to build this piece for him or her. So this one's responding, obviously, it's again historical data, although this works in real time. What I'm showing you here is a sped up video, kind of taking about a weeks long data, and all the change in color, the change in pattern and speed of motion, all of these depend on your sleep cycles. So depending on how light or heavy your sleep was, whether they've hit the REM cycles or not, and so on and so forth. And there's some variations, 2 different encodings. One is this orange and white, and then we had a different encoding. And the last one I'm going to talk about is a digital to physical adaptation. We've installed this piece as part of an art festival in Goa in India just before the pandemic. We were commissioned, this is a curatorial work we had commissioned for this, where they've asked us to install a light responsive work. So we got 3, this is less about data, although there is one data point built in, which is time. So it's a simple interaction between these 3 shapes, a simple square, circle, and a triangle, which is sort of distorted. And they keep evolving, intersecting, moving around, and they never repeat themselves. And the idea was that in the physical space, we installed a haze machine so these 2D patterns were projected on the floor with a haze machine and projected on the top, and these kind of become 3-dimensional in nature. So the people walking into the festival kind of interact with this in real time. And this is for the entire duration of this piece. It never repeats itself. The patterns don't repeat. So I think that's my time, and also the end of presentation. So in the way, all I'm going to summarize is that we started from a specific data. I've been obsessed with data for a really long time, and started off as part of my architecture education, and then over time pulling up threads, all sorts of things for from the art end of things today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karthik. Most of your work, I think I also got introduced today. Yeah, thank you so much. Dushyant, are we ready? Yeah. Yeah, you're on mute, Dushyant. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. Hello. Thanks for having me on this panel. I am Dushyant, and I'm currently an assistant professor at the School of Environment and Architecture. I'm also the co-founder of a design practice called the Urban Project. Today, I will present some works that have emerged from my interest and inquiries in the blurred domains of the digital, physical, and the technological. Computational thinking is intensely thought with data, and we materialize these intensities of data through codes and scripts. My interest is in the apparatus or spatial inhabitation that emerges from these computational logics and its anomalies. So let me to the projects that we discussed. The first is an installation that is that happened in Jawahar Kala Kendra in a curatorial project by Rupali and Prasad Shetty called Penny Space. It was a part of the section on mathematics and universe. So installation was configured in the entrance court of this building designed by Charles Correa. This disjointed cube generated an interesting context to manifestation of the orthogonal flat grid. It's an anomaly in the logic of the grid of the building plan itself. The attempt over here was to use this grid of the and lay out this as a grid of the data. A mathematically crafted grid of 1 by 1 meter was configured to respond with its tensile properties. Gravity became the other grid ended from the terrace level of the court, and it was also further layered with diagonal intersected grid to subdivide it for tension vectors that would be generated with the influence of wind and gravity, and 4 points of contact that it had with the building. The grid was and stitched and knit at within the grid and directionality of the forces were simulated in 1:1 at the spool first, and were then added to create the push and pull in the structure of this grid and the way it acted with wind and gravity. This whole process scale the material behavior of the grid through different knots. A continuous knot along its length were used bidirectionally, and diagonal ropes were added as a layer to it. Adding to it is a fine net that was layered to stiffen and loosen parts of the grid under tension from the different forces acting upon it. At one of the points, the rope controlling the grid was tied to the building. A pulley was installed, which was controlled by a script and an Arduino board to respond to the movements of the forces of the wind, where it released the rope to soften or tighten its movements. Speed by so this is the pursuit here was to control its form, but its behavior. The forms were a resultant of this control, though limiting in its formal variations. New bodily relationships are formed by controlling spatial limitations pertaining to scale of the human height and the range in which it can move, but also allowing to express itself. It's lived for a period of 4 months. So with this, I will conclude this project. Then, as a part of the school and as a research project that we are doing right now, interested in gravity and also composite. So this series is an ongoing experiment initiated as research which explore the possibilities of apparatuses. We call them gravity apparatuses. The formal logics of computation are materialized through an apparatus in these experiments that is intuitive, but also structured through a computed series of steps and negotiated between the somewhat precise operations, and the material properties that shape and structure its form. So the first experiment was a doubly curved surface. Here, the modulation of glass fiber weave under gravity was explored in ways to achieve the possible formations of it when layered with resin manually. My interest is, and that's why the glass is here. This is an experiment, sort of try and test the behavior of this material with an apparatus, with a frame. A frame of 1.8 by 0.6 by 0.6 meters was used to do this experiment. We were you can look at it in the GIF, which is laying next to it. It had to be in the first half was applied with resin once it took form under gravity, and after that the second layer was applied and it achieved some strength as it was upturned to complete the second part. An overlap between the two parts was ensured for it to get enough strength. The image on the right, on the extreme right, is the result of this experiment. It's not the most sensuous or beautiful or even precisely achieved doubly curved surface, but we learned a lot from this one to kind of go to the next experiment. This one, a framework, a workflow, and a computational crafting possibility. So the next,
Dushyant, sorry
we
to
reduce the
interrupt.
scale. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Your voice is cracking a lot. In case you want to just switch off maybe the video or something.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll go to the next experiment where we reduce the scale to an object and wanted to test if the material behaved differently. With the many computational manufacturing possibilities to make objects at scale or even at the desktop versions of tools, including 3D printers or CNC machine or even laser cutters, this process emerges from a domestic making culture and is driven computationally in its operative spirit. Frame of one cube was for we set up a few control points and variables that help achieve a gravitational act and form a set of supports and springs and clamps help fix and vary the points in the frame. A single layer was used first to fix the gravitational form with the weight of the glass fiber weave, and then with the applied resin. It was layered from both sides with a random mesh fiber so as to give it enough material strength. A series of such experiments are underway to explore the relationship of materials, computation, and gravity. So yeah, that's what I have for today, and thank you. You can check out other works on the school website first. Thank you.
Thank you, Dushyant. Thank you for keeping up with the time as well. That brings us to our last presenter, Nihar Mehta, youngest presenter also on this panel. Nihar has recently completed his master's in advanced architecture from IAC, Barcelona, and is currently working at the intersection of computational design, urban data analysis, and advanced fabrication. His presentation today addresses design proposals and policies that influence the socio-economic well-being in the cities. His project, 70% Water, received IAC's Self-Sufficient Building Award in 2020, and also his thesis project, Recode, received Advanced Algorithmic Design Award in the same year. So I'll be presenting for Nihar. So Nihar, just guide me through whenever you want.
Thank you. Thank you, Digital Futures team, for inviting me, and I'm absolutely delighted to share my thoughts with you. Like Bhavleen said, she will be presenting my screen because, in great irony, a computational designer's computer decided to quit on him. Okay, next please. As a student from an architecture school that encouraged self-learning and exploration through what at the time seemed unconventional mediums, it became evident to me relatively early on that buildings have far greater influences beyond their walls, for they have ripple effects on their immediate sites, the environment, and the economy and how they affect the communities that use them. Next. Master's education gave me deeper knowledge and expertise on further confronting these concepts. Alongside a multidisciplinary group, master's education more importantly broadened the umbrella under which design and architecture can operate and eventually have meaningful implications. Next. So I would like to take this occasion and share something that continues to motivate and challenge architects like me, the idea of designing opportunities for impact on social well-being of societies. And in the process, ask these questions: how does one design for social well-being? And what consequences do design intervention have on societies? Next. Through my education and later working with different stakeholders, I've come to realize that I'm playing one or more of these roles. One of an informed stakeholder, an expert citizen, or a responsible decision maker. Next. I believe these three projects, done during my studies, highlight the scope for opportunities at different scale, from an indoor product to a country level report. Next. Bhavleen, next. Yeah. The first project that I want to show you is in the process of tackling a concern that receives relatively less attention, which is the effects of indoor air pollution on health. We spend over 90% of our time indoors and in the process unconsciously inhale harmful volatile organic compounds or VOCs, which result in severe health concerns. Next. Next. Current solutions to fight air pollution create waste and replace harmful compounds in the air instead of eliminating them. So to change this trend, the project's innovation is based on biological reaction of bacteria that decompose the harmful chemicals. It is a targeted purification technique that results in relatively less waste and use of less resources. Next. We are used to the idea that greenery helps in cleaning air, but it is actually the bacteria in the soil that achieves this. With different types of bacteria cultivated in the filter, it can target different VOCs and in the process have an efficiency compared to 1,000 plants per meter square. Next. The result as it stands now is a 3D printed bioplastic column that houses the biofilter designed by us with a type of bacteria culture to suit the use case. Next. The second project I want to discuss is the project that addresses a hypothesis: can efficient management of building resources change the way we live and interact with our surroundings? To do so, the project addressed this by developing a structure that functions as a machine, harnessing the energies of its surrounding through water. Scale prototypes of the machine were assembled to observe the behavior, next, and measure the energies of these elements. And the resulting data was used to simulate an application at building scale. Next. This machine is a cyclic system to exploit the behavior of water at different temperatures and physical states of liquid, solid, and gas, converting different energies and pressure acting on water. The goal of the project thus was to redefine a self-sufficient model that challenges how we traditionally use spaces. Next. One use case explored at length with this machine was by placing the structure on a mountain slope with cold temperatures. This meant altering the machine to the site specification and This meant altering the machine to the site specification and energies of the solar radiation, kinetic energy of wind, and potential energy of water. To the left is what the model was, and to the right is the extrapolation as an architectural intent. Next. In this instance, the system modulates the movement of cold and hot water and water vapor to condition the temperature, humidity, and airflow in the interior spaces, along with being a supply for general utilities like kitchen, thereby eliminating the need for additional resources traditionally used to maintain a livable environment. The self-sufficiency of this project lies in the balance achieved through the decisive management of energy. As a living system, all the elements of the structure respond to one another, acting as a single organism. Next. Traditional urban planning, from these architectural manifestations, I want to shift focus to something that I am currently exploring further, which is the scope of designing opportunities for impact through analysis of urban data. Urban data plays a crucial role in providing information to measure and assess intangible parameters, and understanding these helps decipher patterns of living, forcing us to rethink urban planning for making informed decisions. Next. I go deeper into this through my thesis project, Recode. Next. Where I ask the question that traditional urban planning causes fragmentation of urban spaces and functions, imposing a degree of inflexible and brittle order, increasing the risk of segregation, gentrification, and dispersion. This affects the social and economic balance of the city, a salient aspect for better urban health and sustainable development. Next. One more. This research aimed to decouple urban planning convention based on land use and zoning, next, to one based on performance and operation. The methodology adopted to achieve this was by creating a framework to measure the socioeconomic imbalance in the city, along with a protocol to design proposals for well-being. Next. Urban indicators were carefully categorized, mapped, and analyzed to understand prevailing patterns of vulnerability in the city. Next. And ultimately, a statistical index was constructed to measure the intensity of these vulnerabilities. Next. These calculated measures and these analyzed vulnerable areas. Next. Data achieved from this was used to determine the type of value improvement to combat the specific deficiencies of the city. Next. A proposal was then generated for the city council with interventions and the potential to generate social value. Next. This social value, not just in terms of an architectural intervention, but in terms of its economical value as well. Next. This methodology is cyclic in nature with feedback loops. Next. So to expand the reach of the application, for various stakeholders, such as city council, urban planning agencies, real estate developers, the research developed an urban simulation platform. This provides diagnosis of urban indicators to visualize different vulnerabilities in the city, shows the opportunities of value improvement in any neighborhood or any block. So different stakeholders can select different parameters based on their requirements and thus tailor a proposal. Additionally, the platform allows for active simulation of impact of this proposal on the city. This not only shows the simulation on current data, but also projects future data to with machine learning to show the impact of the proposal in foreseeable future. This empowers the stakeholders for an informed decision-making process. Next. And enables the possibility of impacting multiple parameters in the city, creating a ripple effect of positive change. Next. Using this methodology, the project was able to identify specific blocks in the city and the specific value improvement that can be done to reduce the relative socioeconomic imbalances of Barcelona. Next. In my journey to answer these questions, exploring what it means to design opportunities for social impact and step closer to becoming an expert citizen, informed stakeholder, or responsible decision maker, I'm on the path of being drawn towards these Excel sheets, next, these physical experiments, next, and messy programming screens, next, but also on a path of collaborating with NGOs, city council, and urban planners through projects such as this report that helped a non-profit organization identify strategies to deal with the disproportionate effects of climate change on affordable housing. Next. I would like to leave you with an anecdote that I find quite fascinating. We are all familiar with this iconic photo of Corbusier's utopian vision of Paris. Here he proposed a city where different functions like shops, offices, and parks were distinctly separated. A city where the connectivity of cars was greater than its owners. It almost rendered the city and this model two-dimensional, but we know with great certainty that this is far from what is true. This architect's hand of God creating an absolute of buildings and road becomes an antithesis. Next. For I believe an architect's hand can look like all of this, fidgeting with a machine, fidgeting with a computer, or fidgeting with electronics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nihar. It was really interesting to end at that note and begin to much more larger conversation with Neil and team. Thank you to all the presenters as well.
Yeah, can I maybe chip in? So thank you for this presentation. That was great. One of the interesting questions it raised is where Indian students go to study for a postgraduate course. I used to teach at IAC, and there were always hundreds of Indian students there. There was a kind of mafia involved, and it seems also the Städelschule has a number of Indians, and it's kind of interesting the way that I mean, is that in India? What is the perception of studying abroad? Because it's almost like there are places that everyone wants to go to. I mean, the AADRL is another place where there were a lot of Indians in the past. But that's what I was going to throw it out there: is why is IAC and the Städelschule, why are they so popular with Indian students? I mean, is there some kind of tradition in India of where they become, these are important places to go? I mean, again, the great schools. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just want to come in. For me, I mean, at that moment of time, all the schools in the US, like all IT or engineering students from India, they all go to US. And for architecture, there's always a question, always a dilemma, like, you know, Europe or US, and it's more about region rather than schools. I mean, I would say it's equal in terms of regionality, or maybe in terms of what education that you get. Because for some of us, it was also difficult to sort of, in terms of the fees, it's kind of difficult for us to reach US unless you get scholarships. And the other aspect, I think European schools at that moment of time when I took admission were much more experimental as compared to American schools. And that's why Europe, and within Europe, then, you know, the AA is sort of still, was still expensive. At the same time, you know, there were other schools, there was a whole new fabric, you know, the A Vienna, the Barlache, the Städelschule, and all of these were kind of, you know, springing up that time. So I think that's what kind of made me go to Städel. And the thing is, the way in which my work is presented to, I mean, I was also interested in experimentation, and I think that's something that made me be at Städel. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the schools I used to teach at was in Dessa, Dia, and that is free. I'm sure Städelschule must be almost free as well. But there weren't many Indians there, so it's just kind of, I guess there's certain places that are in vogue for Indian students. I think I don't know. I mean, it's interesting why you there anyway. But no, that's Yeah.
I think I definitely agree with what Dushyant just said, because the opportunity and the course that was presented at the Stadial Schule was definitely something that interested me a lot, because we were at Stadial Schule dealing with contemporary technologies and new tools and how we apply them to architecture. So if I speak for myself, it was definitely one of the biggest points that brought me to Stadial Schule.
I think I'm the only one from the US here. So personally speaking,
And
I think
Karthik. Yeah.
Oh, and
Karthik
okay.
from 2010 batch, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. But I mean, personally for me, I think I naturally gravitated towards the culture at the University of Michigan, particularly in the MS program, because more often than not, I get a question that goes back to why would you choose a Master of Science over a Master of Architecture, and what makes you choose one over the other. And also, in a lot of ways, since it is high tech, but it also has some components of low tech, I think a lot of these methodologies sort of were easier for me to make imaginary bridges between, and sort of being able to work closely with people like Sean Alquist or Wes McGee, Katie Newell, and Matthias Del Campo. So I think it was a no-brainer for me personally to pick Tomlin College, or the DMT to be specific, over a few other schools in Europe.
I think I'll add something to that, because I've seen I was looking at grad schools in early 2000s, so 2008 and 9. At that point in time, especially as an Indian student, the only schools you heard about were either the DRL program at AA, and then much later we did hear about the program at Columbia and SciArc. But otherwise, we didn't have much exposure. I mean, we didn't know that there was anything outside these three, or maybe a couple of more schools. The Bartlett, of course, UCL Bartlett. So when I did my grad school and I finished, I came back. I'm teaching now. A lot of students, and I've seen a lot of peers who I studied with, and also a lot of faculty who were there teaching us at GSD and MIT, are now operating in Germany and other schools in Europe. So now when I teach, and a lot of students, I advise them, I ask them, expose them to all these other schools, saying, look, there's a whole body of work that's happening, and these are people who are really good, who are teaching now in schools in Europe. So you have an opportunity to look up both Europe and US, and definitely today I can say a lot more people, my students have gone more towards Europe than US. Although, of course, there is still a significant chunk of people who go, but I think it's also happening more in Europe.
Can I add to that? I think there are two things. Like, one is the question of affordance, how much you can afford as a course. And the second is the discourse that you are kind of aligned to as an individual. And I think at Stadial Schule particularly, there was this diversity that we had professors from UK, USA kind of coming even as guest lecturers or for seminars or for workshops. So I felt that kind of an international essence that the school provided. So I felt that maybe it's a great place to be. Yeah.
Prashant, maybe I could ask you a question while you're there. So I was intrigued because let me disclose the fact I wrote a book about the aesthetics of politics, or rather the aestheticization of politics, a book called The Anesthetics of Architecture, but where I was borrowing from kind of, I guess, Frankfurt school culture. And this is the thing I found surprising, that there was no reference to critical theory, especially as Adorno had written about in Rethinking Architecture, and there's an essay by him about ornament and things. And I was just curious about that, because it was such a sort of, when I was teaching in the UK, we were looking at Frankfurt, right? And you're in Frankfurt and not looking at the Frankfurt school. Is that I mean, how did that, what is the view about the Frankfurt school in Frankfurt, in State Schule? I mean, I'll add to that I don't know who was a dean when you were there, but Nicholas Hirsch was a dean there for a while, and his brother is actually a philosopher and a scholar of Adorno and Benjamin. So I would assume there must have been huge references.
No. Actually, it was super interesting, because we had the Swedish philosopher Daniel Birnbaum, and he actually was curating a whole exhibition on virtual reality, augmented reality, and it was the same time he was also taking lectures. So we actually had philosophy class from him, about Adorno, about Deleuze. So that was the discourse that we also were having as we were studying architecture in my last 2 years. And Shivani was also my classmate, so we had these kind of discussions amongst each other.
Well, if you're interested, we're going to do some sessions on Benjamin and Deleuze on our Sunday thing, which I think could be interesting to see. But no, it was just a huge reference in the UK. Everyone was looking at Frankfurt. Yeah. So the other question I had was, given all this, I mean, it's actually, I mean, now I realize that maybe my question about the computational architects is a bit old-fashioned. I mean, I went to India and a few years ago, 6-7 years ago, and I think there was only one school that had a robotic arm, but it seems now that things are picking up. And I could imagine there could be a kind of Strelka type organization, a school emerging in India based on you guys bringing it back. Has there been any kind of development in terms of new schools that are following the model of IAC or Städelschule back in India? I guess not.
Yeah. No, yeah, Karthik, go ahead. You can maybe talk from the Bangalore perspective on what's happening more in that part of the country.
So yeah, okay. So from a computational design perspective, there's definitely a lot of shift. From the time I'd come back in 2013. And I was teaching in 2014. I remember the first batch I taught here for computational design. I had a big group of students who were so excited, but the school, final year students in architecture, some of them didn't work on CAD yet. So that was where I started off. But 6 years later today, there are lots of schools the pace at which this developed in terms of skill set, in terms of theory, in terms of all other stuff has been significant. And I know a lot of my peers had come back around the same time, maybe but in a span of 2 to 3 years. Almost all of us are teaching. So in terms of computational design itself, I definitely see a big swing. And of course, there are all these workshops and all the other ecosystem that's developed really well. In terms of digital fabrication, I see schools are now investing. There are some in Delhi, there's one in Pune. There are some dedicated programs too. But by and large, I also see a lot of my peers doing it as part of the studio. So we've decided to, I know architecture firms, smaller firms or recent smaller teams are investing in the robotic arm or all sorts of things and working at the cutting. I mean, in India, from where we are, definitely pushing the boundaries of fabrication, which is beyond outside the academic circles, because schools are still a bit slower in that sense in adopting the fabrication end of things.
No, I think I completely agree with Karthik also on that note that most of the schools, more than the schools, I think individuals are planning as artists or architects to invest in digital fabrication, and through that kind of centralized location of one big fabrication lab is what it will further get disseminated into academics as well, hopefully. Yeah. Dushyant, you want to talk about? Yeah.
So yeah, it's been kind of fragmented, but the kind of influx of these, thought processes and computational methods and processes of working within the schools. But beyond, I mean, and they become very specialized courses. They don't become deeply integrated within the architectural discourse. And that's where most of the schools are at right now. And I think that there is also a cultural, not a resistance, but a cultural kind of dissolution that, there are so many methods, so many ways to make by hand. And in that, this computational tools and methods, they somewhere become exclusive in kind of, although many schools now have many tools and robotic hands and 3D printers or laser cutters, but there are so many simple methods to sort of get it done. So, but with a computational thought process. So that's where the full integration, because it's a super a global north sort of perspective to thinking of computation, and that's where it may or may, I mean, that's a speculation. It may or may not fully sort of enter India like it is in IAC or maybe some other schools in the West. So yeah, that's.
I'll add just one interesting anecdote to this. So what I've seen happen here is the studios who are practicing computational design, who are trying to push the boundaries and actually execute on ground. Eventually, the digital end of things is easier. I mean, we've got the tools, we've got the techniques, and we're well versed, and there are studios doing phenomenally good work. But we still have to fall back on the construction tech in India, which is still kind of backward compared to the countries in the West. So now the successful studios here are able to design digitally, but are able to translate that into really physical, I mean, very hands-on, like what Dushyant is trying to adhere to, like really not relying on tech in the fabrication end yet, and still executing things. I mean, we hope that will change by the adoption of fabrication tools, but for now we do that. We come back to a very manual hands-on approach.
Like to an extent, as just to add, as a part of our research, it's underway. We are learning from 3D printers and trying to sort of do a manual process by hand to deposit material, because there's a whole skill based on, say, there's a food, they make jalebis out of a particular tool which is similar to a 3D printer sort of a deposition. But so yeah, all sorts of cross cross cultural kind of things are happening, and yeah, it's.
I think it's also interesting that how the idea of craft is also changing over here, like with the existing set of craft knowledge that we have and the knowledge of digital tools coming in, and how the craftsmen also learning newer techniques and having that intersection of working with the drawings that are actually produced by grasshoppers, difficult codes and all, and they end up producing their own versions of it. So that kind of knowledge sharing that is happening back and forth and in a good feedback loop for us also as practicing architects is very, very interesting here in India.
I mean, maybe just one comment to throw in there is that many of these schools, even though they operate in one particular country, actually most of the students are from other places. When I taught at the AA, I didn't have a single British student at the AA, and then you've got Zaha's office, which doesn't have very few British people. IAC is the same actually. There were very few. I think only one Spanish student when I was teaching there. So it's kind of strange that they're kind of, I don't know about the Städelschule, whether there are any Germans there, but it's kind of, there's this model of these kind of places that kind of spring up in response really to demand, because no one else is doing what they're doing. I think IAC was born of the failure of most schools to actually provide computational tools and so on. But they're often kind of deterritorialized in some senses. They might exist in one particular place, but the students come from all over. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions from YouTube or? I think it also brings me to another question, especially for Prashant, Shivani, Misri, and Nihar, and because we're Gustavo, you want to go ahead first? Okay.
I'll jump in. I wanted to thank everyone today for their wonderful contributions. Yeah. As very inspirational. I just wanted to ask a quick question. How has the role of technology impacted your work conceptually as well as theoretically? And how do you see your role as an architect building this community to make change in the world? Not financial change, but community change. And I guess I'm talking about climate change that we have to deal with, inequities in economy, and in education too. If you can respond, please.
Oh, I think I could jump in on this one because I think after a point I was heavily influenced by low-tech and their want to upcycle shipping containers, but also at the same time, my time at Taubman College was also somewhere between using a machine, but also using analog ways of making. And a lot of these collaborations were also with industry partners. And that I think was very insightful, especially for me, because then I got a sneak peek of what's happening in academia at the same time, sort of understanding how glass industries work, or even with the fellowship at Lawrence Tech, it was partially funded by Ballard International, which is purely buying and selling robots. So I think a lot of insights from what's happening in neighboring industries with respect to architecture, or largely sort of categorized as a built environment, was essentially because I got to interact with an acoustic specialist or a material scientist or a robotic engineer. So towards the end of it, or to sum it up, I'd say technology and materials definitely greatly influences my work now at the University of Tennessee, but also at the same time looking at sort of neighboring industries to blur the boundary between what we consider as a raw material, or what we consider to be a typical workflow to produce certain geometries, has definitely sort of been slightly skewed and warped after these experiences. Or even with one of the examples, which is looking at reclaiming metal waste, but to think of that as a building material was particularly challenging, simply because I'm not a material scientist, but I also got to interact with metals, or got to interact with robots, to know enough to have a conversation with professionals from each of these backgrounds. I would say it's a mix of all, which is kind of blurring the boundaries at this point.
Actually, I could also add something, like when we were looking at these tools of virtual reality, augmented reality, and we had quite a lot of interactions about topics that related to neuroscience and development of brain. So I think these tools and techniques, they are in a way also contributing in other sciences. And I think virtual reality has provided like new insights into the activity of brain and how it functions. Also, there are ways in which it could treat your phobias, and it could provide with you interesting sensory illusions within a highly controlled environment. So there are a lot of potentialities that these tools can have if you kind of expand their usage out of the architecture context. Yeah.
Yeah, I can add. So the way I see it, I think it's quite contextual. I think the way we discuss technology, because there's a very we can say a global or a standard sort of idea of technology. But I think, say in India, there's a lot of population to sort of deal with, and what does technology do or play a role from say our end in these industries. And I think that's where my interest was in exploring the domestic space, and that's where the networks are, and that's where the equities are, and that's where the possibilities to sort of take these techniques or technologies to a level or a possible network where it could be used widely, at the same time not become an exclusive place for someone to sort of participate. And still most of the buildings still throughout the world, and also majorly in India, still made by hand. And that's where I think the kind of role becomes quite crucial. And that's where context of these technologies. So, yeah.
Maybe I could just add something very briefly. I mean, I know that at Angavanta there's been some kind of a lot of interest in neuroscience. There was a conference there recently, and there's a guy called Wolf Singer as well, who's a neuroscientist who's been involved in these particular schools. But I just want to mention there is actually someone we've invited to Digital Futures several times, whose father was from India. His name is Anil Seth, and I would just recommend him because he's a brilliant neuroscientist who's got a PhD in AI. Yeah, and his book Being You has literally just come out, but he has a TED talk that has 12 million viewers. So I just would recommend having a look at Anil Seth. He's a exceptionally smart neuroscientist whose father was from India. Yeah.
Also, when we were discussing about how technology has impacted us and with the tools and techniques as well, in my experience, it altered the way I work as well, because it was also the time of pandemic and also where I was working on developing my project. And I realized actually that the only collaborator that I was working with was the AI. So it was me and it was the algorithm, and it was just a collaboration between two of us where I'm working remotely to create an entire alternate reality and so on. So it also made me realize that how these tools are going to change the way that we work in the future as well.
If I may answer this again, is that I think for me, it's what technology allows us to exploit methodologies, not just through architectural sensibilities, but also through various different fields, and sort of translate the conceptual information that in a crude sense architecture gives into quantifiable values that you can actually then share with different stakeholders and convey information which can lead to a certain real world project, and not just stay in the realm of concept.
Yeah. I think it's quite interesting what we just discussed, because it again brings me back to what we started off this whole discussion with, the idea of what would be the hybrid practices look like, whether it's we are located here, temporarily located out of India, or are permanently located back to our countries. It's interesting how our practice is not just shape shifting, but we are maybe branching out to multiple different disciplines as well. So I see that quite evidently in many of the younger presenters who have joined, Shivani, Prashant, Misri, and Nihar, who will pioneer a lot of interesting ideas and bring them back to the country or wherever they are. So
That's actually very relieving to hear. Thank you, Bhavleen. But also at the same time, and maybe this is because the invite came through and I was scratching my head about what to present. And that's when I actually looked back at the trajectories, because to be completely honest, academia wasn't the plan, but I guess things happen to happen when you're sort of researching and you start to see how this could potentially become applicable. But also at the same time, more often than not, you're asked questions like, where did you pick up this skill even? Because even if we were to look at a CNC knitting machine, it primarily comes to the fashion industry, or it's thought of as a machine that makes our sweaters. But to sort of appropriate a machine like this, to think of it as architecture or as a potential formwork system, also has a few sort of challenges associated with it when we're trying to speculate, which is why I was curious if any of the speakers or even the kind of work you sort of showcased that looked at making, I was wondering if it was a top-down approach, or sort of to foresee what a material can do and sort of work backwards, or does that then emerge from a trial and error to make a language of itself, or to make a catalog or a dictionary of all different experiments?
I think, as you rightly said, that we are not maybe we are trained as architects, right? So we might not essentially know how a certain machine works or how a certain code works and so on. So for me, it is more like a process where you stumble across something and you learn a process and you come up with a result, and it does create like this entire catalog or generate so much data with the kind of with each experiment actually. So I think architecture is now heading towards, with the kind of work that we do, a very interdisciplinary field, where it's not just a traditional idea of what an architect does is just like make buildings, plan section, elevations, but it goes now so much more beyond the definition of an architect, I would say.
And I think, and I think in Shivani's case, the collaborator is Shivani and the machine itself, or the AI. And maybe in Misri's case, it's also machine, but there's also like other fabrication aspect. So where you get the human labor, which is involved in making things. So the degree of collaborations is like kind of expanding, and it could go in any directions, so to say.
I couldn't help but think when you were making your presentation, I mean, I don't know much about this, but I know that Gandhi was very much against machines making anything, right? It was all about the individual Indian worker operating that way. Is that partly that kind of culture that's what has meant that people have resisted so far computation in schools of architecture? What is the dominant climate? I mean, in terms of what has been really the driver of schools of architecture in India?
I think a lot of it was definitely in undergrad, especially, was definitely focused on having to like hone the skills that go back to analog ways of making, but also seeing what's out there to sort of marry the two is what I'd say. But also, as soon as I was at Lotech or Tobin College, that perspective sort of was warped a little bit, because now you could go down to the water jet and cut a metal piece. You wouldn't have to necessarily go to a fabricator like we would in undergrad to get it made. So I think that notion of going, or that instantaneous behavior of digital straight to physical was definitely shortening that process for sure. But after finishing grad school this past year, I went home for the first time after 3 years, and suddenly I'm seeing people making bricks and using metal molds. And for 3 years before that, I was using CNC knitting machines or KUKA robots. So there was, I think, a moment, I wouldn't call it epiphany, but also at some point I was trying to justify what I did and what I could potentially do, because they're both sort of thriving in their own ways, and still practices that have been sort of going on for 2000 years versus what's happening at these schools, or even a lot of schools in Europe like ETH or ICD is so tech heavy that a part of my brain wanted to merge the two, because I think what the craftsmen have already is decades or thousands of years of knowledge, which I think is just revolving in the same kind of audience. And here we're also sort of revolving around a similar kind of audience. But I think there could potentially, or my brain wants to potentially make a slightly more meaningful collaboration between the two, where we could sort of piggyback on the craftsmen, because they've been practicing that for decades, versus something that's prevalent in the West, which is machine heavy or very white, pristine. And by white, I mean the finish of it, it's very glossy. And then everything that happens with craft, or to broadly categorize that as Southeast Asia or the Middle East as well, is more analog, or it still has that beauty of being very tactile. So that's where I stand right now. And more often than not, I'm also perplexed with a question to think of what it would look like to merge the two and have a meaningful conversation between the two disciplines.
Can I just throw something out there? Because it's the first time I've seen AI work being produced by an Indian architect. Just recently, I've been, well, tomorrow, in fact, I'm giving a lecture to some students of architecture in Korea. And when I first started talking to Korean students about AlphaGo, which was, Go is a national game in Korea and China, right? So what was amazing is when AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol, the leading kind of Go player from Korea, is that it caused what was called the Sputnik moment, in the sense that it was a kind of wake up call to China and to Korea. We've got to get involved in AI. This is really important. This is our national game, and AI has beaten one of our best ever. So that was hugely significant. And I'm just wondering, because chess is always a game that I associate with India. Was there any reaction back in 1997? Well, what kind of reaction was there back in 1997? Maybe it was too. You were all pretty young then, but to when Garry Kasparov was beaten by Deep Blue, was it a big issue in India?
It was.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
And did it prompt an interest in AI itself within the country? I guess not within architecture.
No.
In architecture, though, I think it did capture because we do have Viswanathan Anand, a big chess player from India, who's well known, and also, although our primary sports we follow us other things, but there is a definitely big following for that particular person. So Garry Kasparov, when that happened, there was a lot of interest that spiked in, saying how was this possible. But I guess we were also at a time, and I could be completely wrong, but I think in terms of IT, in terms of tech, it didn't. I mean, the masses were still not used to this notion of technology as they are today. So and also I was quite young. I mean, I'm just guessing that although it did become a big moment, I'm not sure if it really translated as the impact, in the sense if people really read it as it was magic. I guess that's what the understanding was, that something happened.
To just add to that, when I went for my master's in 2008, my final year portfolio was still done in hand, and it was a super shift for me to go to Stadel and learn Rhino. So it was, even though a decade after that win in 1997, it was still in architecture. It's still not kind of present in that moment. And on the other hand, games like chess or other things, I mean, they are seen as games. They're not perceived as, what is the logic of those games, or where could they go, or what they kind of bring in with that. And to just add to what Misri was saying a little earlier, and your question for Gandhi, the culture of Gandhi, and then it kind of the way in which Indians perceive things is, like, for me, what I've come to know from the studies there, and even here, spending some time here, there is no standard, there is no high tech, there's no low tech, there's nothing. If you need to do something, everything that is available, right from a hammer to a 3D printer, is at a disposal. And every Indian, like, it's somehow in our culture that we would start mixing all of them together. We will not differentiate, and that's where you don't find schools like IAC or very focused schools with computational thinking present. There's a lot of mix, and for that matter of fact, that the term called jugaad, that jugaad, which comes from this attitude where kind of mix and match everything
of
to
hacking and tinkering.
Yeah. So you would find that hacking in every process, and that's why that very dominant technological base has not been kind of very clear here. It's always blurred, it's always mixed. Yeah.
No, I think I agree with both Misri and Dushyant, and I feel at some point universities or schools, architecture schools, stopped being the research labs or research hubs the way it started a couple of years back. A lot of knowledge that is transferred has become just knowledge transfer from one point to the other, and it has never become like a student faculty kind of exchange program, although there are some really promising schools coming up. Dushyant is part of one. I'm part of a school in Mumbai. There are a couple in Bangalore and all, and even Far East also is doing really, really interesting work, which is what is required, which is essentially where we will come to like a research lab kind of an environment, which is experimental and is necessary also.
Yeah, I just think that maybe now is the time for a completely new institution to start up in India. That seems to me the huge demand. I mean, given the fact that these other institutions serve that absence in India, I think you could make a school work much more cheaply in India and looking at these tools than you can elsewhere. So I'm expecting to see something pop up fairly soon anyway. But is there maybe there's another question really that comes up, the fact that is there another kind of cultural desire to kind of see what is going on in Europe and India over and above the question about technology? Is that a driver of Indian students going abroad to go and study?
Sorry, are you saying, were you asking if technology is a driver for
No,
students
no,
to
no.
go?
I mean, well, we've been talking about how these schools like IACA have been, have the technology, and it's a chance for people to India to go and do that. But I'm just wondering, is there a kind of cultural curiosity that leads to this kind of experience of studying elsewhere? I think among Chinese students, it's a driver, just to go and see a completely different sort of world.
I'm sure. I mean, I'm speaking for myself, but I think a lot of people I advise also students, they do want to explore. It is a big difference both in culture and context when they step out. So a lot of my students who ask me saying, should we do a postgraduate program? My advice to them is very simple. I say, look, if you expect to do it because you're going to come back and work and get a bigger pay, then that's the wrong approach. But if you want to go out because you want to explore, put yourself out of your comfort zone, collaborate with other peers, people who are not used to here, and you get exposed to new environments, by all means go, because that will definitely change how you think and operate later. And I think definitely there's a big driver among other things, especially for architecture, because other fields in India, the drivers are different. The tech industry, the driver is very different. But for design industry, at least the design schools here, the students who do step out, I guess one of the big drivers is that they want to put themselves out there in a new environment.
So just to add to that, like the architectural education here, since probably when we were studying and even now, it is still the same. The syllabus or the kind of things that are covered are still the same. They also are a resultant of the British architects practicing before independence, and the architects. There was no architecture degree. The Indians were at that moment of time trained to be draftsmen, and that syllabus or that training, that knowledge, that training has become a syllabus, and there is a constant frustration with that, because you're still studying, say, something which was 50, 70 years old. And when you look at the West, when you look at these other cultures which are, experimenting a lot, that's what drives. I mean, that's what is the driving factor. At least for me, that was the driving factor to really move out and see what's happening, to even learn from those things and kind of come back. And that frustration I can still see today with many of these students who are, I mean, of course, in the last 3 to 5 years, it has been a little different. But before that, and especially in my time, it was the case. So yeah, that's something is why also many of them move out to study. There's a lack of postgraduate serious postgraduate studies in India.
No, I once went to Chandigarh and went to see the School of Architecture there. That's completely locked into Le Corbusier, right? In a very kind of nostalgic way. And it struck me that actually, when he was practicing, there was almost nobody as iconoclastic or revolutionary as Le Corbusier. Think about the Phillips Pavilion, some of the later works in his career. But somehow he's become this kind of godlike figure who's followed in a very kind of traditional mold, which I found quite surprising, I must say.
Yeah. Neil, we have some questions and some comments, very good comments also from YouTube. And Studio is asking, maybe some of you already know about the Studio. Is there more focus on data visualization than using data for design decision? How can data play a bigger role in design? So maybe some of you want to address this. the questions are also in our Zoom chat in case you want to go ahead.
I'm not sure if I can add to it, but just wanted to say one thing. Definitely, everyone here should take a look at Ant Studio's work. One of the few studios who've been doing the things that we talked about, from computational design to actually trying to fabricate and push the boundaries of, also an EAC alumni from a few years back. And also is pushing towards both setting up a fabrication unit and towards doing a more formal teaching component, which kind of reflects the things that we're talking about. Sorry, I mean, I just know him, close friend, and we collaborate on a lot of work. So it's good to see his question.
And there are few comments. Sorry, anyone else wants to say anything? Yeah, there are few comments even for Shivani. Continuing to Shivani, where she was saying how the machine or AI is working, there's where Dushyant's point coming in, where he said that the human interaction working by hand to understand the process of machine and vice versa. So I think our audience is quite engaging with the later conversations that we had. And Pritish is saying we would like to see transformation from creating data to physicality of space. I think Misri also opened up the similar conversation. Anyone wants to throw a light on any of these comments on your chat?
Yeah, I would definitely sort of second that notion of wanting to convert data back to a sort of usable material, because and this is one of the projects that wasn't shown because we're just waiting for a press release. But we, with Katie Newell, Wes McGee, and Zachary Belanger, we were working with glass as a plate or a flat material to sort of water jet it and slump it and check its acoustic properties. So I guess it was really important for us to sort of think about translation from physical to digital. So we did start from a digital file to sort of slump a glass piece, but also creating that feedback loop becomes wildly important when you're talking about sound or acoustics or starting to quantify it, which is why I think scanning in this case, personally speaking, was really helpful for us to sort of create or close the loop between, is it doing what the simulation suggests, or does the material sort of react slightly differently because, again, it's glass and hence has its own sort of properties related to it. But more often than not, it also throws that question up in the air about how precise are simulations, or how important does it become to translate the physical studies back into digital so we can have a closer, more intimate sort of relationship with what we're really making. It's really helpful even with the concrete project to understand something like fabric, which was again related to stitch types and stitch lengths, which is a very tactile way of making. But also the way it slumps is different based on how thick the layer of concrete would be even, and hence it would be slightly deeper or wouldn't be as deep and be slightly shallow, but that changes the structure itself. So we were relying a little on the simulations, but we were hoping we'd also get a few scans out, which didn't work at the time, but we got that a lot later, and we had major revelations come out of that as well. But there's a lot of parameters at stake here, which is why it's sort of harder to navigate through all of these parameters to get as close as you possibly can to the physical geometry on a digital platform.
To respond to the question, actually, I didn't understand it exactly, but I would like to add to it that to work with AI, there's always, I would say, an element of human input as well. What we input into the AI and what result we get with the kind of images and the images that we add in and the kind of output that we get, that is, there is a vast data set, but it's also up to us as to how we read it, what we take from it, because there is so much data that, I mean, it literally can boggle you, like, okay, so much. But there's also I would say that it is a collaboration between the AI, the algorithms, and the human, what we perceive it to be, how we read it, and how we understand it.
Maybe I could just throw one more question out there. I mean, I'm based in the States. I'm in California, Venice Beach. So, although I'm from England, right? But here in the States, we have a very hybrid vice president in the form of Kamala Harris. I'm just wondering what impact, and obviously she's the first female vice president in the States, what impact Kamala Harris had on Indian culture as a kind of, as a model, as should we say?
There is, to say there's a very strong patriarchy here, and I don't think that it has really made any difference to that extent in the country currently.
Mm.
Even politically, it is not sort of made any difference, not just as a gender of the person, but also politically. I mean, it's yeah.
Interesting.
So I think this brings us to the end of the session today. Yeah, but if there are any questions from the audience or from amongst the panel, you all can reach out to us. And Neil, do you want to say anything about the next coming sessions? We also have another session on India coming up on 30th of October.
Yeah, maybe you could say something first about the other one on India, and I'll maybe comment on the sessions coming up.
Yes, so I think we're going to continue on many of these conversations because on 30th of October, we're going to have a session again with some of the practicing architects, but talking about the ideas of speculative futures, the idea of architecture in gaming, the ideas of what architecture practice in India, what it means to be practicing in India in the age of digital. So the session will be chaired by Nuru Kareem, and we're going to have some really interesting panel discussion. We look forward to you guys being present there and coming for that session as well. So it's on 30th of October at the same time, 4 p.m. CET, 7:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Yeah.
So just to mention that we have Raja is doing a tutorial on paneling tools next week, which is next Saturday, which is going to be very useful. And on the Sunday, we have a theory one, which was part of the doctoral consortium, where we are actually, I would say this is actually part of an ongoing process. Next semester, we'll have some other ones coming in. And these are intended not necessarily just for doctoral students, but would-be doctoral students. I think a lot of master's graduates would love to go and do a doctorate, but maybe don't have the opportunity. So it's kind of part of that. And I think it's going to be some amazing discussions. So I look forward to others joining in. Well, I just want to thank Bhavleen for her incredibly infectious enthusiasm and energy that has made this session work. And it was great to see this work coming out. And it's a real, I think this is one of the successes that we've found in Digital Futures, is that you tend to think about the world in terms of your Facebook friends. Actually, I'm not on Facebook, but never mind. You have a very limited sort of range of things. And when you think of people who you could invite, you only think about the people you can invite that you know, right? And I think what is so interesting is when you open up to meet a whole group of new, highly talented architects from coming out from a place in India. That's really the success of Digital Futures, and that is kind of exposing the real talent that's out there. And I think the other thing we always try and do is, I know that in the past, and still to some extent, let's say Europe and America have kind of have been places where Indians come. I think in the future we look to very much the opposite, the flow in the other direction. What can we learn from things coming out of India? And it seems to me that very soon we're going to be paying attention to those kind of things. So it was really very gratifying to see seeing such amazing work coming out today, and really novel and different. So thank you, Bhavleen, and thank you all the presenters.
Thank you.
I wanted to say also, I use this expression all the time. We're like an iceberg. You can see a few people here, but actually there's a huge amount of work that's going on behind the scenes, as Bhavleen knows only too well. So I want to thank also the team of Digital Futures. So we look forward to seeing for the next episode, as it were, the follow up on this. Yeah. And thank you for presenting. And I want to also thank, since I wasn't around last week to hear him, thank your compatriot Maya Misri, who did that tutorial. It seemed to be incredibly popular. So it's kind of watch this space. We, give us. I think a few years' time we will all be sitting up and paying attention to the things that are developing in India. That probably will. It may be in the way that we saw in the previous hybridity session, where I think the Chinese students had come home and they had taken it much further. It wasn't just a question of kind of like of learning the tools, but really appropriating them and then taking them further. So we look forward to seeing something astonishing happening there soon. So thank you, Bhavleen, and thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you, Neil. Thank you so much. Thank you, guys.
Thank you,
so much
everyone.
for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.